I'm a little biased, but this is actually one of my favorite features to talk about the Test Explorer. Test Explorer in previous versions was getting very long in the tooth, fairly painful. It hadn't had significant upgrades, and I'm excited about what's now available in the Test Explorer. So the whole UI has been rewritten over testing. Whether you're working with MS Test or XUnit or NUnit, it doesn't really matter. It works across all the same. But there's a bunch of new UI features that are available. To start, you'll notice that there's a settings here. Click the drop down. And in here, you'll notice that there's an option to run tests after build. So the idea is we want to move the discovery of errors as close to development time as possible. And if we go ahead and check the checkbox that says run tests after build, essentially when we build, it automatically goes and starts running your unit tests. And as a result, you start to get reports about your unit tests failing almost instantaneously after you do a build. And so that's a feature that I almost always go turn on. This is not an enterprise feature, so you don't have to have enterprise installed. So there's live unit testing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But just to go get testing running, there's a run tests after build feature. And then the other thing you'll notice, it keeps the, in this case, VS Test Console running. So instead of restarting that process, it keeps it running to go and get your test to execute faster. That said, on occasion, you will find that it leaves that process around and it holds on to files that you don't want to have held onto. And in that case, you need to go to the command line and actually kill that process. You can do that with Visual Studio running and it'll just restart the process. So that works fairly cleanly. The other thing that's interesting, I'm not going to reproduce right now, but if it tries to write, if the compiler tries to write to a file and the file is in use, so let's say it's your DLL is still in use, so the test project has still got it loaded. It actually gives you the PID, the process ID, for that, for whatever file is holding on, whatever process is holding onto that file, which means you can go to the command line or wherever you go do stuff to delete processes. As far as I know, there's only a command line, but there's probably other ways I don't know about. So I would go to the command line. You can go ahead and type kill and the name of the process ID, and it'll go ahead and kill that. Or if you really want to make sure, you can use sort of a PS kill or something like that to go kill that process. And Visual Studio handles that restart no problem. It just continues to execute and all goes well. So the other feature that you need here to be aware of is there's run tests in parallel, which allow you to get your tests executing significantly faster than they were in the past. The thing to be cognizant of here is that running tests in parallel means you can't be sharing any test data between your projects. For obvious reasons, it's going to modify that data. And so it should start to prompt you at this point to, as you start to create more unit tests, whenever you create a new test class, think very carefully or avoid, as much as possible, avoid having tests that would collide with each other if they happen to be running at the same time. So don't reuse file names, things like that, because you're going to end up with problems. And work hard to design your tests so parallel is supported. And it's non-trivial, just to be clear. Things like, oh, I loaded a config file, I wanted to make sure I wrote to the config file correctly. Let's write 3 tests that write to the config file. Well, if the config file is actually a config file and not a mock, then you're just preventing yourself from running in parallel, and the errors you're going to back is like access denied errors, and they're going to be a pain to work through and trying to figure that out. But where possible, think carefully in your test design, how do I enable the ability to run tests in parallel? Another feature that we've been waiting for with .NET Core that's been finding pretty difficult to get enabled is that we can now run analyze code coverage for all tests, and this is not limited to an enterprise feature in Visual Studio. This is simply a reference. So you simply need reference assembly and you get it. And it's actually referenced for you automatically when you create a new project. So if you go on the command line or in Visual Studio, you do .NET new and you type MS test for the template, it will go ahead and add a test, an assembly to your project called coverlet. Sorry. That was not my test project. And so it goes ahead and adds coverlet to your project. And now you can go ahead and get code coverage of your project. And the UI within Visual Studio will go ahead and take a look at that. So now I can actually go to analyze code coverage against my project. And then I will get the UI such I can see which parts of my process are actually executed by my tests or not. It gives you the output we used to see exclusively in... it's still running. Exclusively used to see this in Enterprise, but now it's available with just standard versions of Visual Studio. Waiting, sorry. So here's my code coverage report. And you can go and specify sort of where you want to drill into. And then once you find something that you're want to pay attention to, you can actually go then double click on it. And you'll notice here, hey, I didn't write a test that passed null into main.args. This might be a place I want to go ahead and add tests to verify the capability. And so code coverage is included. And it's more than just a percentage report. By the way, the percentage report is not based on lines. It's based on blocks. Thank goodness. That's a good thing. It's based on blocks. So you can sort of focus in where do I want to go ahead and add my tests. And when you got code coverage enabled, it also shows up inside Azure DevOps. So you can get sort of results coming out of that. And there's also an option in Azure DevOps to actually say things like, automatically, if my code coverage drops, then reject the build. So you can start, presumably you're going to start more than 0. As soon as you got more than 0 code coverage, you can actually check that checkbox, and it's literally just checking a checkbox. You can check the checkbox in Azure DevOps and make sure that all new code coming in is actually got unit tests associated with it, so your code coverage doesn't drop. This is really important because sometimes we're overwhelmed by writing unit tests for existing code. Brownfield world, we didn't know about writing unit tests. We now hear it's the best thing since Swiss cheese, and we're like, I just overwhelmed, it's way too much work. But if we have a build task that says just make sure you're keeping it the same or going higher, then you can always make sure that you're improving your code as you go. So it's just this minor little checkbox that you're like, nobody thinks about, but I think it can make a significant impact on improving your code without a lot of work. I think I've showed you all the features. And there's one more keyboard shortcut that, as far as I recall, didn't exist before. You can now do, if you go into your test, let me just open a test. You can do Control RL. Let me be clear. Control L, lift your hands off the keyboard. Control R, lift your hands off your keyboard. L will run your last set of tests. So if you're working, you've got a test working, and then you go into your production project, you make a modification, you're like, okay, now rerun that test. Control RL will rerun that, and so you can just keep re-executing that test over as you modify your code and keep going. And so it's a keyboard shortcut that I love to have, rather than navigating back to the Test Explorer window or navigating back to the test and pushing Control RT. You can just rerun the last set with Control RL to get that test running. Yes?
Control RD will do the same, but under debug.
Control RD will do the same under debug, or Control R, Control L will do the same thing if you want to do it under debug, I believe. In all, I believe it's pretty consistent. I might be a little bit off. I, of course, write perfect code, so I don't need a debug, but I've heard that debugging is relevant for other people. So the way the keyboard shortcut works is if you use Control R and then hands off keyboard T, that's a run operation, and it will run the context of the test you're currently in. If you're in one test, it runs one test. If you're in a class and not in a particular method, it will run all the tests in that class. If you use Control R, Control T, it will do the same thing, but in debug mode. So this gentleman said here you can use Control D for debug. I use, because I try and map the same keyboard shortcuts, just using the Control key twice will give you the debug operation automatically in that context. So it's just my memory, the way my memory works. Not very well, but that's how it works. Okay, talked about code coverage. We've already talked about this to get an update on that.